When my dad sat me down in the living room that day, I could tell something was wrong. He had that look he gets when he's about to deliver bad news, the one where he rubs his temples and avoids eye contact. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy. I braced myself. Was it about my grades? My finances? Had I done something to upset him? But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. "Diane wants me to cut ties with you," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "She's given me an ultimatum. Either I stop seeing you, or she's leaving." I froze, the weight of his words sinking in like stones in water. "She what?" I finally managed to say. "Are you serious?" "She says she can't live in a house where you're part of the picture," he continued, looking more tired with every word. "She wants me to choose her or you." For a moment, I thought he was joking. Diane had always been cold toward me, sure, but this? It felt like something out of a bad soap opera. "You told her no, right?" I asked, my voice tinged with panic. "Of course I told her no," he said firmly, finally meeting my eyes. "You're my child. That's not up for negotiation." At first, I felt a wave of relief. My dad had chosen me. He hadn't let Diane manipulate him into abandoning me, and that meant everything. But as I processed his words, the relief gave way to anger. What kind of person even asks that of someone? "She's always hated me," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "That's not true," he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. She doesn't understand our bond." I almost laughed at that. Diane didn't understand our bond because she didn't want to. From the moment she entered our lives, she had made it clear that she saw me as an obstacle. Family dinners turned into tense affairs where every word I said was met with thinly veiled disdain. Holidays became battlegrounds, with Diane rolling her eyes every time my dad and I shared a laugh or reminisced about old times. But even knowing all of that, I never thought she'd stoop this low. What followed was a whirlwind of chaos that turned my world upside down. Diane didn't just walk out of the house that night. She filed for divorce within the week. And she didn't just want to leave my dad. She wanted to destroy him. She hired a lawyer who specialized in high-conflict divorces and went after everything. The house, the savings, even the car he drove to work. It was like she'd been planning it all along, just waiting for the perfect excuse to pull the trigger. Watching my dad go through it was gut-wrenching. He was a good man, the kind who worked hard his whole life to provide for his family. And now, everything he'd built was being ripped away from him because of me. At least, that's how Diane made it seem. "She's telling everyone this is your fault," he told me one night, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "She's saying I chose you over her, that I've been prioritizing you at her expense." I felt a pang of guilt, even though I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. "Do you regret it?" I asked hesitantly. He shook his head without hesitation. "Never. You're my child. And no one, not Diane, not anyone, is going to come between us." His words meant everything to me, but they didn't make the situation any less painful. Diane wasn't just leaving. She was taking as much as she could on her way out, and she was determined to make sure my dad and I bore the brunt of it. And as the weeks went on, it became clear that the chaos was only just beginning. Looking back, the signs were all there. Diane never made much of an effort to hide her disdain for me, even in the early days of her relationship with my dad. At first, it was subtle. Cold smiles, dismissive comments, little jabs that I brushed off as harmless. But over time, her dislike for me became impossible to ignore. She hated that my dad still referred to me as his #1 priority, as if that title somehow took something away from her. Any time he helped me with something, whether it was covering a semester's tuition or lending me his car while mine was in the shop, Diane acted like it was a personal betrayal. "We have our own life to think about," she'd snap, loud enough for me to hear. Holidays were the worst. Every Christmas, my dad insisted on keeping certain traditions alive, decorating the tree together, watching It's a Wonderful Life, and opening presents in our pajamas. Diane barely tolerated it, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, rolling her eyes at every inside joke or shared memory. I could feel her resentment in the air, like a storm cloud hanging over the room. As time went on, her disdain became more overt. Family dinners turned into awkward standoffs where every conversation seemed to devolve into an argument. If my dad and I reminisced about old times, she'd cut in with a snide remark. "We've all heard that story before," she'd say, draining the warmth from the room. Vacations were no better. My dad once invited me to join them on a trip to the mountains, a simple getaway that was supposed to be relaxing. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. Diane spent the entire trip complaining about the extra expense of having me there and made a point to exclude me from every activity. One afternoon, when my dad suggested we all go hiking together, she shot him a glare so sharp it could have sliced through glass. Even simple phone calls seemed to annoy her. If my dad was on the phone with me, Diane would find an excuse to interrupt, banging pots in the kitchen, loudly asking when he'd be done, or rolling her eyes dramatically if I was on speakerphone. It was like she couldn't stand the idea of him giving me any of his time or attention. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Blended families are complicated, I told myself. Maybe she just needed time to adjust. I went out of my way to be polite, to stay out of her way, and to avoid doing anything that might upset her. But no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. Over time, it became clear that this wasn't just a case of clashing personalities. Diane didn't just dislike me. She wanted me gone. She saw me as an obstacle, a rival for my dad's love and attention. And she was determined to win, no matter what it took. I started noticing the little ways she tried to undermine my relationship with my dad. She'd forget to pass along messages when I called or make plans for the two of them without telling me, ensuring I felt left out. She even went so far as to suggest that I was too dependent on him, despite the fact that I was working part-time while putting myself through school. "You need to cut the cord," I overheard her say to my dad once. "She's an adult now. She doesn't need you holding her hand." "She's my daughter," he replied, his tone firm. "I'll always be there for her." His loyalty meant everything to me, but it only seemed to make Diane angrier. The more he stood up for me, the more determined she became to drive a wedge between us. Looking back, I realize I spent years walking on eggshells, trying to keep the peace while Diane slowly tightened her grip on my dad. Every disagreement, every awkward moment, felt like a battle I was destined to lose. I didn't want to believe she was capable of tearing us apart, but deep down, I think I always knew. Diane wasn't just trying to create a life with my dad. She was trying to erase the part of his life that included me. And as her resentment grew, so did her determination to push me out of the picture. It wasn't until she gave my dad that ultimatum that I realized just how far she was willing to go. The breaking point came over something that should have been a simple, joyful milestone: buying my first car. My old beater had finally given up the ghost, and I needed a reliable vehicle to get to work and school. My dad offered to help with the down payment, making it clear from the start that it was a loan, not a gift. "We'll set up a payment plan," he said. "I trust you'll pay me back when you can." I was grateful beyond words, but the moment Diane found out, everything spiraled out of control. She acted like my dad had handed me the keys to their entire fortune, and she wasn't quiet about her feelings. That night, while I was still basking in the excitement of my new car, I got a text from him. "Diane's upset. We'll talk tomorrow." I didn't realize how bad it was until I went over for dinner the next day. Diane didn't even look at me when I walked in. Her arms were crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. When I tried to thank her for being understanding about the loan, she snapped, "Don't thank me." I didn't agree to it. Later that evening, I overheard their argument. Diane's voice was sharp, cutting through the walls like a razor. "You're playing favorites, Dave," she yelled. "You're putting her ahead of us, of our future." "She's my daughter," my dad shot back, his tone exasperated. "This wasn't a gift, it was a loan. She needs help, and I'm her father. That's what parents do." "Well, maybe parents should learn when to cut the cord," she hissed. "She's an adult, Dave. She shouldn't be running to daddy every time life gets a little hard." I froze, torn between staying put and walking away. Part of me wanted to confront her, to defend myself, but I didn't want to make things worse. So I stayed silent, listening as my dad stood his ground. "This isn't about the car, Diane," he said. "This is about you not wanting me to have a relationship with my own child." From that point on, Diane's hostility toward me went from cold to downright icy. Every visit to their house was a minefield. If she wasn't ignoring me completely, she was making passive-aggressive comments designed to cut me down. "Must be nice to have daddy's wallet on speed dial," she said once, loud enough for everyone to hear. I tried to let it roll off my back, but it wasn't easy. No matter how polite I was, no matter how much I tried to keep the peace, Diane found ways to make me feel like I didn't belong. Even my dad noticed. "You don't have to come over if it's too much," he said one day, his voice heavy with guilt. "I hate seeing you put through this." But I wasn't about to let Diane push me out of my dad's life. "I can handle it," I told him, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. To his credit, my dad defended me every time Diane crossed the line. He told her I was his child and that he'd always be there for me, no matter what. But his loyalty only seemed to fuel her resentment. It was like she saw me as a threat to her control over him, and she was determined to eliminate that threat, no matter what it took. The tension came to a head one evening when I stopped by unannounced to drop off a payment toward the loan. Diane answered the door, her expression somewhere between shock and anger. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone flat. "I came to give Dad this," I said, holding up the envelope. She stared at me for a long moment before finally stepping aside. "He's in the garage," she said curtly, then turned and walked away without another word. When I found my dad, he looked surprised but happy to see me. "You didn't have to bring this over tonight," he said, taking the envelope. "I wanted to," I said. "I thought it might help smooth things over with Diane." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Don't blame yourself for this," he said. "She's making this a bigger deal than it needs to be, and that's on her, not you." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that things were reaching a breaking point. Diane's anger wasn't just about the car, it was about control. And as much as I wanted to believe we could find a way to coexist, I was starting to realize that she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. The car was just the excuse she needed to escalate things, and I had no idea how far she was willing to go. The memory of that day is etched into my mind like a bad dream I can't shake. My dad called me in the middle of the afternoon, his voice quiet and strained. "Can you come over?" "I need to talk to you," he said. I could tell from his tone that something was wrong. When I arrived, he was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. For a moment, I thought he might be sick. "What's going on?" I asked, sitting down across from him. He took a deep breath, staring down at the table as if searching for the right words. Finally, he looked up and said, "She wants me to choose." I frowned, not understanding. "Choose what?" "You or her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She says either you're out of my life or she is." It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself as his words sank in. She actually said that?" I managed to say. He nodded, his face a mixture of guilt and anger. "She's been saying it for a while, but last night, she gave me an ultimatum. She says she can't stay in this marriage if you're part of my life." "What did you say?" asked, my voice trembling. "I told her no," he said, firmly meeting my eyes. "I told her I'm not going to abandon my child, no matter what." A wave of relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by heartbreak. How could someone put my dad in such an impossible position? And how could he stay with someone who would even ask that of him? "I don't understand," I said, shaking my head. "What does she want from me?" "I've tried to stay out of her way. I've tried to be polite." "It's not about what you've done," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "It's about control. She doesn't like that you and I are close, and she's decided that's a problem." For the next hour, we sat at the table, trying to make sense of it all. My dad told me about the arguments they'd been having, how Diane had been growing more and more insistent that he cut the cord and focus solely on their marriage. "She says it's not normal for a father to be this involved with his adult child," he said, his frustration evident. "I told her that being a father doesn't end when you turn 18. I wanted to scream, to cry, to march over to Diane and demand answers. But I knew that would only make things worse. So I sat there, numb, as my dad tried to reassure me. "I don't want you blaming yourself for this," he said, placing a hand on mine. "This is her issue, not yours. And I'm not going to let her push you out of my life." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely audible. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He gave me a small, sad smile. "You won't have to find out." But before I could process everything, things took an even darker turn. Diane didn't just threaten to leave. She followed through. That night, my dad called me again. "She's gone," he said, his voice hollow. "She packed her bags and left." I didn't know what to say. Part of me was relieved, but another part felt a deep pang of guilt. "Dad, I'm so sorry," I said. "It's not your fault," he replied quickly. "She made her choice, and I made mine." But it didn't stop there. Within days, Diane filed for divorce, and she wasn't going quietly. She went after everything, money, property, even the car my dad drove. It was like she wanted to punish him for choosing me, and she wasn't going to rest until she'd taken as much as she could. Watching my dad go through it was devastating. He was already reeling from the emotional toll of the ultimatum, and now he was facing a financial and legal battle he wasn't prepared for. And the worst part? Diane made sure everyone knew she blamed me. "She's telling people this is your fault," my dad said one evening, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "She's saying I chose you over her, and that I never prioritized our marriage because of you." Tears welled up in my eyes as I listened to him. "Do you regret it?" I asked hesitantly. "Not for a second," he said firmly. "You're my child, and I'll always stand by you. No matter what." His words were a lifeline in the chaos, but they couldn't erase the pain of what Diane had done, or the storm that was still to come. Diane didn't just leave my dad. She declared war on him. Within days of walking out, she filed for divorce, and it was clear from the start that she wasn't interested in a clean break. She hired one of the most aggressive lawyers in town, the kind who thrives on high-conflict cases, and made it her mission to take everything she could. My dad was blindsided. He'd always been a fair and reasonable man, and he assumed Diane would approach the divorce the same way. But this wasn't about fairness, it was about punishment. She wanted him to suffer for choosing me, and she wasn't pulling any punches. She combed through every detail of their finances, demanding a larger share of everything they owned. The house? Hers. The car? Hers. Even the savings my dad had worked decades to build were on the table. By the time her lawyer was done, my dad was left with little more than the clothes on his back and a small retirement account she hadn't been able to touch. Watching my dad go through it was gut-wrenching. He'd worked his whole life to build a stable future, and in the blink of an eye, it was all gone. The house he'd poured so much love and care into, the car he'd bought with pride, the financial cushion he'd carefully saved, it was all taken from him. He moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the comfortable home he'd shared with Diane. It wasn't just the physical loss that hurt, it was the emotional toll. My dad wasn't a man who showed his feelings easily, but I could see the strain in the way his shoulders sagged, the tired look in his eyes, the way he spoke in quiet, measured tones as if trying to hold himself together. "You don't deserve this," I told him one evening as we sat on his new, second-hand couch. "It's just stuff," he said with a shrug, though I could tell he didn't believe it. "I can start over." I wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. This wasn't just about stuff. It was about the years he'd spent building a life that Diane had dismantled in a matter of weeks. And what made it even worse was how she justified her actions. Diane didn't just walk away with everything. She walked away with the narrative. She told anyone who would listen that she was the victim, that my dad had chosen me over her, and that she'd been forced to leave for her own sanity. "She's poisoning people against me," my dad said one evening, his voice tinged with frustration. "Every time I run into someone we used to know, they look at me like I'm some kind of monster." It was infuriating. Diane acted like she'd been wronged, as if she hadn't been the one to issue the ultimatum in the first place. She spun the story to make herself look like the hero who'd bravely walked away from an unsupportive marriage, conveniently leaving out the part where she'd tried to push me out of my dad's life. Even mutual friends started to distance themselves. I heard through the grapevine that Diane had been telling people I was a spoiled adult who manipulated my dad into prioritizing me over his marriage. It was humiliating, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. Despite everything, my dad refused to stoop to her level. "I'm not going to play her game," he said when I suggested he set the record straight. "People who know me will see the truth eventually." I admired his integrity, but it didn't make it any easier to watch him struggle. The financial hit was hard enough, but the emotional toll was even worse. My dad had always been a proud, self-sufficient man, and now he was starting over at an age when most people are settling into retirement. I did what I could to help. I visited often, cooked meals, and helped him organize his finances. But no matter how much I tried to ease the burden, I couldn't erase the pain Diane had caused. It wasn't just about the money or the house or the car. It was about the betrayal, the realization that the woman he'd loved and trusted had been willing to destroy him to get her way. And even though he never said it out loud, I knew he was carrying guilt over what this had cost me. "This isn't your fault," I told him one night as we sorted through boxes of his belongings. "I know," he said quietly, "but that doesn't make it hurt any less." The worst part was knowing that Diane had gotten exactly what she wanted. She'd punished my dad for refusing to abandon me, and she'd done it with a smile on her face. And as much as I hated her for it, there was nothing we could do. She'd already taken everything. After the dust settled from the divorce, my dad moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a small kitchen, a cramped living room, and a bedroom barely big enough for his bed and a dresser, but it was his. He spent his first few days there unpacking boxes filled with the remnants of a life he'd worked decades to build. Gone were the sprawling house, the manicured lawn, and the garage he'd turned into his workshop. Now his world was contained in a few square feet and a handful of battered cardboard boxes. It wasn't easy. My dad was in his 60s, with limited savings and no real assets left after Diane had taken everything she could. He'd planned to retire in a few years, but now those plans were nothing more than a distant dream. Instead, he picked up a part-time job at a local hardware store to make ends meet. It was exhausting work, especially for someone his age, but he refused to complain. "This is just a new chapter," he said one evening as we ate takeout in his tiny kitchen. "I've been through worse." I admired his resilience, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. His hands, once steady and strong, now trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee. His posture, once upright and confident, seemed a little more hunched every time I saw him. Yet, through it all, he stayed strong for me, if not for himself. I did everything I could to help. I visited often, bringing homemade meals and groceries to ease the burden. I helped him organize his bills and set up a budget for his new reality, something he hadn't needed to worry about in years. On weekends, I'd drag him out of the apartment for walks or trips to the farmer's market, anything to get him out of the small, confining space he now called home. He never asked for help, but I could tell he appreciated it. "You've got enough on your plate," he said one day as I stacked Tupperware containers of leftovers in his fridge. "And you've had enough taken from you," I replied. "Let me do this." He smiled, the kind of soft, tired smile that made my heart ache. "You're a good kid," he said. But no matter how much I tried to help, there were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. One night, as we sat on his worn-out couch watching an old sitcom, I found myself apologizing for what felt like the 100th time. "I'm sorry this happened, Dad," I said, my voice breaking. "I hate that you're going through this because of me." He turned to me, his expression serious. "Stop," he said firmly. "This isn't your fault, and I don't want you carrying that guilt. But if it weren't for me, if it weren't for you," he interrupted, "I wouldn't have had a reason to stand my ground. You're my child. Nothing is more important than that." His words hit me like a wave, washing away the guilt I'd been carrying for so long. For years, I'd felt like I was the source of all the tension in his life, the reason Diane had pushed him to the brink. But in that moment, I realized just how much he loved me, and how far he was willing to go to protect our bond. Hearing him say it meant the world to me. It didn't erase the pain of what Diane had done, but it reminded me that some things were worth fighting for. My dad had lost so much, but he hadn't lost me. And for both of us, that was what mattered most. Over time, my dad began to adjust to his new life. He found a rhythm at work, where his coworkers quickly grew to admire his steady demeanor and extensive knowledge of tools and repairs. On weekends, he started volunteering at a local community center, teaching basic carpentry skills to kids. "It keeps me busy," he said, though I could tell it gave him a sense of purpose. We settled into a routine of our own, too. I'd visit him once a week for dinner, and he'd come to my place every other Sunday to spend time with me and my friends. Slowly but surely, the wounds Diane had inflicted began to heal. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all threatened to pull us under. But we faced it together, one step at a time. My dad might have lost almost everything in the divorce, but he hadn't lost his spirit. And through it all, he never once regretted his decision to stand by me. "She thought she could break us," he said one evening as we sat on his tiny balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "But she underestimated how strong we are together." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "We'll get through this," I said. And we did. Not because it was easy, but because we had each other. And, in the end, that was enough. Karma has a funny way of working itself out, and in Diane's case, it didn't take long. A few months after the divorce, whispers started circulating through the small social circles she and my dad used to share. At first, I tried to tune them out. I wasn't interested in anything about her life. But the more I heard, the harder it was to ignore. Diane's new relationship, the one she had seemingly staked everything on, had imploded. The man she'd left my dad for, a flashy real estate developer who was apparently her ticket to a better future, had dumped her. According to the rumors, he'd been seeing someone else behind her back the whole time. By the time Diane found out, it was too late to salvage anything. He ended things abruptly, leaving her to pick up the pieces. But that wasn't all. Without his income to lean on, Diane was struggling to keep up with the mortgage payments on the house she'd fought so hard to take in the divorce. She had overestimated what she could handle financially and underestimated how expensive it would be to maintain a lifestyle she couldn't actually afford. Word was, she was teetering on the edge of foreclosure. When I first heard the news, I didn't know how to feel. On one hand, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a flicker of satisfaction. Diane had tried to ruin my dad's life. She'd taken everything she could from him, dragged his name through the mud, and tried to paint me as the villain in her story. Seeing her life fall apart felt like some kind of cosmic justice. But as the days went on, that satisfaction gave way to something else: pity. For all her scheming and manipulation, Diane had ended up with nothing. She'd burned every bridge she had, alienated the people who cared about her, and chased after a dream that had crumbled beneath her. "She's her own worst enemy," my dad said one evening when I told him what I'd heard. "Do you think she regrets it?" I asked. He shrugged. "Maybe. But I don't think it matters. She made her choices." My dad, on the other hand, was starting to find peace. It wasn't easy. Rebuilding his life at his age was a challenge, but he approached it with a quiet determination that I couldn't help but admire. He'd reconnected with old friends, people he'd lost touch with during his marriage to Diane. They welcomed him back with open arms, offering him the kind of camaraderie he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He also found solace in his part-time job at the hardware store. What started as a necessity quickly became something he looked forward to. He enjoyed the sense of purpose it gave him, the routine, and the chance to help people with projects big and small. "It keeps me busy," he said with a small smile. "And I get to talk about tools all day. What's not to like?" But the biggest change came when my dad started talking about his dreams again. For years, he'd put his own wants and needs on hold, focusing instead on Diane's demands and the responsibilities of maintaining their life together. Now, for the first time in a long time, he was thinking about what he wanted. "I've been thinking about taking a road trip," he told me one evening as we sat on his small balcony, watching the sunset. "Where to?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Everywhere," he said with a laugh. "There are so many places I've always wanted to see. The Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Route 66. Why not now?" I smiled, a lump forming in my throat. For so long, my dad had been weighed down by everything Diane had taken from him. But now, he was finally starting to focus on what he could build for himself. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was his, and he was making the most of it. As for Diane, I don't know what happened to her after that. The whispers eventually died down, and she faded from our lives like a bad memory finally being put to rest. Part of me wondered if she ever thought about my dad, if she regretted the way she'd treated him, or missed the stability he'd offered. But in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that my dad was happy again, in his own way. He'd been through hell, but he'd come out stronger on the other side. And as I watched him plan his road trip, a new excitement in his eyes, I realized something important. Diane might have taken a lot from us, but she hadn't taken everything. She hadn't taken our bond. She hadn't taken his resilience. And she hadn't taken his ability to find joy in the little things, even after everything he'd been through. For that, I was grateful. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly free. The ordeal with Diane left scars, but it also created an opportunity for my dad and me to grow closer than we'd ever been. For years, I had felt like I was walking on eggshells around him, carefully calibrating every interaction to avoid stirring Diane's ever-simmering resentment. I didn't want to create more tension between them, so I kept my visits short, my phone calls polite, and my emotions locked away. But now, all of that was gone. Without Diane looming over us, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. For the first time in years, I felt like I could just be with my dad. There were no veiled insults to deflect, no passive-aggressive remarks to endure. It was just the two of us, rediscovering what it meant to have a relationship untainted by her presence. At first, it was strange. After years of tiptoeing around each other, we weren't used to this new dynamic. But slowly, we found our rhythm. We started spending more time together, watching old movies, going for long walks, and sharing meals where the conversation flowed freely. We talked about everything: his childhood, my struggles at work, even Diane and the chaos she'd left in her wake. One evening, as we sat on his balcony with cups of tea, my dad opened up about how he had felt during his marriage to Diane. "I didn't realize how much I was losing myself," he admitted. I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping the peace, but all I was doing was letting her chip away at who I was. I nodded, understanding all too well. I felt the same way, I said. I spent so much time trying not to upset her that I stopped being myself around you. He looked at me, his expression heavy with regret. I'm sorry for that, he said quietly. I should have done more to protect you from her. I thought I was keeping things balanced, but I was blind to how much it was costing you. Hearing those words felt like a balm on an old wound. For years, I had carried the guilt of feeling like I was the cause of the tension in their marriage, but in that moment, I realized it wasn't my fault. Diane's anger wasn't about me. It was about her own insecurities. And my dad's choices, though flawed, had always come from a place of love. Through our conversations, I began to let go of the guilt I'd been carrying. My dad made his choice, and he didn't regret it, not for a second. If he could forgive himself for the mistakes he'd made, then I could forgive myself too. Our newfound closeness became a source of strength for both of us. We started creating new traditions, like weekly movie nights at my place or Sunday breakfasts at his favorite diner. It wasn't about replacing the past, it was about building something new, something that was just ours. One afternoon, as we walked through a local park, my dad turned to me and said, "You know, I never realized how much I missed this. Just spending time with you. I missed it too," I admitted. He smiled, and for the first time in a long time it felt like everything was going to be okay. The bond we rebuilt didn't just heal the wounds Diane had left, it reminded me of the strength of our relationship. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real, and it was ours. There were moments when I still felt the sting of everything we'd lost, especially when I thought about how much my dad had sacrificed. But then I'd look at him, at the way he was rebuilding his life piece by piece, and I'd feel a surge of pride. He wasn't bitter or defeated. He was moving forward, and so was I. If Diane's departure had taught us anything, it was this. Love isn't about control or competition. It's about showing up for each other, even when things are hard. And now, for the first time in years, I felt like my dad and I were finally on the same page. Letting go of the past wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Because in letting go, I found something far more valuable, the kind of relationship I'd always wanted with my dad. And this time, I wasn't going to let anything come between us again. As the months turned into years, the chaos Diane had unleashed on our lives began to fade. What once felt like an overwhelming storm of loss and upheaval slowly gave way to something that resembled normalcy. My dad, ever resilient, found his footing in his new life. The tiny apartment he had moved into after the divorce was a stepping stone, not a destination. Over time, he saved enough to sell it and buy a cozy condo closer to me. The condo was perfect for him. It had just enough space for his needs, a comfortable living room filled with sunlight, a small but functional kitchen where he could cook his favorite meals, and a spare bedroom he jokingly referred to as the guest suite, even though it was mostly used for storage. It wasn't extravagant, but it was his, and he took pride in making it a home. "Feels good to start fresh," he said one day as we unpacked boxes together in his new living room. "No ghosts here, just us." With Diane out of the picture, our lives settled into a rhythm that felt easy and natural. We made it a point to spend holidays together, just the two of us, or three if you count my dog, Max, who quickly became my dad's favorite companion. Thanksgiving dinners were no longer tense affairs filled with Diane's passive-aggressive remarks. Instead, they were warm, laid-back evenings where we cooked together, watched football, and laughed over old family stories. Christmas became a highlight of our year. My dad insisted on keeping some of our old traditions alive, decorating the tree together, watching It's a Wonderful Life, and exchanging small, thoughtful gifts. Max, ever the center of attention, loved tearing through the wrapping paper, much to my dad's delight. "You know," he said during one of those Christmas mornings, sipping his coffee as Max trotted around with a new toy in his mouth, "this is what it's all about. Just being with the people who matter." I couldn't have agreed more. Meanwhile, Diane faded into the background, becoming little more than a distant memory. Through the grapevine, I heard she had moved out of state, but I didn't bother keeping track. She was part of the past, and that's exactly where I intended to leave her. Occasionally, her name would come up in conversation with mutual acquaintances. Someone would mention that she was struggling to find steady work or that she had been seen in the area briefly before disappearing again. But I never gave it much thought. Whatever she was doing, it had nothing to do with us anymore. My dad, too, seemed uninterested in her whereabouts. "She made her choices," he said simply when someone brought her up. and I made mine. What mattered wasn't where Diane had ended up, it was where we had. Despite everything she had taken from us, she hadn't been able to destroy the bond my dad and I shared. If anything, her actions had strengthened it. We'd come through the storm battered but intact, and that was more than enough for me. As time went on, life took on a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. My dad continued to thrive in his new environment, reconnecting with old hobbies and friends. He even joined a local hiking group, a hobby he had given up during his marriage to Diane. Seeing him so full of life again was like watching someone rediscover a part of themselves they'd forgotten. For me, the peace we'd found allowed me to focus on building a future of my own. I started advancing in my career, made new friends, and even began considering the possibility of starting a family someday. Through it all, my dad was my biggest cheerleader, offering support and encouragement every step of the way. We'd lost a lot in the wake of Diane's departure: money, stability, and the illusion of a peaceful family life. But we'd gained something far more important: the knowledge that we could weather anything as long as we had each other. One evening, as we sat on his condo's balcony watching the sunset, my dad turned to me and said, "You know, I wouldn't change a thing." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Not even the divorce?" "Not even that," he said, "because it brought us here. And here is exactly where I want to be." I smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for how far we'd come. Diane might have tried to tear us apart, but in the end, she had only brought us closer together. We had survived the storm, and now we were standing in the calm, stronger than ever. It wasn't the life we had planned, but it was ours, and it was enough. Looking back on everything Diane put us through, I've come to realize that her manipulation and greed were only part of the story. Yes, she took more than her fair share of money, property, and peace of mind. Yes, she tried to paint herself as the victim while vilifying me and my dad. But in the end, none of that defined the journey my dad and I went through. The real story was about the strength of the bond we shared, and how, despite everything, it came out stronger than ever. Diane wanted control. She wanted to be the center of my dad's world, and she saw me as a threat to that. But what she didn't understand was that love isn't about control. It isn't about making someone choose between two impossible options or tearing down the people they care about. Love, real love, is about loyalty and sacrifice. It's about standing by someone even when it's hard, even when the world seems determined to pull you apart. My dad showed me that kind of love, and it changed everything. For years, I had carried the guilt of feeling like I was the source of the tension in his marriage. I worried that I was asking too much, or that my presence was somehow unfair to Diane. But through his actions, my dad made it clear that none of this was my fault. He chose me, not because it was easy, but because it was the right thing to do. Family isn't about perfection or always agreeing. It's about the people who stand by you when it matters most. My dad and I didn't always see eye to eye, but he never wavered in his support for me, even when it cost him so much. That kind of loyalty taught me more about love and resilience than any relationship I'd had before. It also taught me to let go of the things I couldn't control. Diane's actions weren't about me. They were about her own insecurities and her need for control. Once I realized that, it became easier to stop blaming myself for what happened. My dad didn't regret his choice, and neither did I. Together, we found a way to rebuild what Diane tried to tear apart. One of the most important lessons I learned through all of this was that love isn't something you can buy or manipulate. Diane spent years trying to control my dad, thinking that she could secure his loyalty by making him choose between us. But real love doesn't work that way. It's not about conditions or ultimatums. It's about showing up day after day and putting the people you care about first. For the first time in my life, I felt truly secure in that love. I didn't have to earn it by being perfect or prove my worth to anyone. My dad made it clear through his actions that I mattered, that our bond was unbreakable, and that no one, not even Diane, could take that away. Diane might have taken our house, our money, and our sense of stability, but she couldn't take the most important thing: our relationship. If anything, her attempts to drive us apart only brought us closer together. Now, as I reflect on everything we went through, I feel a sense of peace I didn't think was possible. The storm is over, and we've come out on the other side stronger and more connected than ever. My dad and I didn't just survive Diane's betrayal, we thrived in spite of it. Love isn't about the things you have or the battles you win. It's about the people who stand by you when it matters most. And for that, I'm more grateful than words can express. Diane's chapter in our lives is closed, but the lessons she taught us, unintentionally, perhaps, will stay with us forever. We've lost a lot, but what we've gained is far more valuable. And that, I think, is the real victory.